Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo, founding partner at Nextier. Nextier is a multi-competency advisory firm focused on solving Africa's complex development problems. Over the past decades, every Nigerian government, whether civilian or military, has discussed the need to diversify the economy. Why have these governments failed to accomplish this goal? Is it due to a misunderstanding of the task, or a misrepresentation of or misinterpretation of the main challenges? Is it corruption, which we always go to, or incompetence, or Nigeria's political economy, or the economy's structural challenges? Joining me today to unpack these many decades-old questions is Dr. Zainab Usman. She's a senior fellow and the founding director of the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. She's the author of Economic Diversification in Nigeria, The Politics of Building a Post-Oil Economy. Her enduring areas of expertise is identifying the policies and institutions to enable low and middle-income economies to harness their natural resources to achieve sustainable economic development. Prior to the Carnegie Endowment, Zainab was at the World Bank as a public sector specialist, where she worked on social sustainability, energy policy reforms, natural resource management, and digital technologies. She's worked in a series of African countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Congo, Morocco, Nigeria, Tanzania, also Papua New Guinea, Uzbekistan, Serbia, and so on. Zainab, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me because sometimes the audio of my computer is not always very good.
I can hear you now. And let me start by thanking you again for a very enjoyable lunch we had in DC a while back, where you also gifted me a copy of your book, very well researched. Thank you. I guess we'll start with maybe a short presentation from you. You should have access rights to share. Probably spend about 20 minutes on that presentation, which will then follow a conversation between us for another 35 to 40 minutes. And then we open it up for audience participation. Please, participants, post your thoughts, comments, and questions in the Q&A box, and I'll read them with proper attribution. Zainab, if you're ready, you can share.
Sounds good. Let me do that just a bit. Let's see. Can you see? Can you see?
Yes, we can.
So let me switch to slideshow. Oops. Hold on. Can you see it? Or
Yes,
is it in? I hope you're not seeing the what is it, the back end?
No, I can see the presentation, Economic Diversification in Nigeria, the Politics of Building a Post-Oil Economy.
Okay. You know
Yeah.
what? Try. Okay. So, excellent. Good. Very honored to be in the midst of everyone, and hopefully we can have a discussion with the participants today. The presentation is really basically the title of the book, Economic Diversification in Nigeria, the Politics of Building a Post-Oil Economy. So this is an outline of what I'll be talking about over the next 15 to 20 minutes. I'll talk about the background to the book, why I wrote it, how I went about the research, and then I will highlight the key arguments and the key messages. Then I will conclude with some key points, the key points that I actually highlight in the conclusion chapter of the book. And then I have a section that I've entitled Addendum. These are just kind of new trends and new realities that I didn't directly cover in the book, but I think are still relevant to a discussion on economic diversification in Nigeria. Now, starting with the background, what problems is this book trying to address? Why did I write the book at the time that I did? So it was published in 2022. This is getting to almost 3 years now. And then why is the topic even important? Hopefully this is quite evident why it's important. I think it's something that every Nigerian and every Nigerian analyst and observer understands to be a key priority for the country. So some basic facts here. I mean, I'm sure most of the people on this call know these basic facts. I mean, to the extent that we even have data to to call these facts. Nigeria is Africa's most populous country, with a population of somewhere between 210 million to maybe 280 million people. We really don't know because the last census was done in 2006 and it was a very problematic census. But we do know that Nigeria has a very large population. It's a population that is very dynamic, with entrepreneurism, with energetic young people, but also there is a lot of poverty. We also know that Nigeria is growing at around 3.3% per annum. This growth has been basically steady, I think, with the exception of 2020, 2021, when there was a recession, and then I think 2015 or so, when there was at least 1 quarter of negative growth of contraction of the economy. But I would say basically since around 2013, 2014, the economy has been growing roughly at around 2 to 3% per annum. This is somewhat comparable to the country's population growth rate, to the extent that we can talk about the growth rate of the population. I mean, if we don't know the denominator, how can we talk about the rate of growth of the population? But anyways, the country has had about 2 recessions in the last decade or so. And there's this part of, sorry, just skipped it, of the box that says Africa's 4th largest economy. And I just changed it right now before I started the presentation. Previously, I had Africa's largest economy there, but I'm sure a lot of you have come across an analysis done by Bloomberg based on data from the IMF that projects that Nigeria this year is most likely going to be downgraded to Africa's 4th largest economy. For a number of reasons. Obviously, the depreciation of the value of the naira, and then our slow growth, among other factors. So this is actually quite significant, and it's something I would like for us to talk about a little bit more, because it's not just numbers, it's pretty significant. Then also, Nigeria has a very large entrepreneurial base, and it's always remarkable to me how entrepreneurial the Nigerian population, according to a survey done by the Small and Medium Scale Enterprises Development Agency of Nigeria, I think back in 2017 or so, they counted 44.5 million micro, small, and medium scale enterprises in the country. A wide range. Obviously, the vast majority are micro enterprises, mostly one-man businesses, but there are also hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of small and medium-scale enterprises. And then we also know that obviously Nigeria has industrialist tycoons, and I have the picture here of really the key, perhaps the archetype of the industrialist in Nigeria today, which is Aliko, who is Aliko Dangote. The country has the world's 2nd largest film industry by number of films produced, not by capitalization. And this speaks to the creativity of the country and basically the creative industries and creative economy. And then finally, Nigeria is or maybe was, Africa's largest oil producer. I think depending on the month, sometimes Angola exceeds Nigeria's oil output. The country is currently producing at, I think, a maximum of 1.4 million barrels a day, which is, again, something we can talk about a little bit more. I think this is really a tragedy. And I think I can speak bluntly to this audience. If I'm presenting this to a more global audience, I would kind of be a little bit more selective in the words that I use, but this is a largely Nigerian audience. So this is really a tragedy because at the beginning of this century, the country was producing 2.1 million barrels a day. And the ultimate objective was to increase production capacity to 4 million barrels a day. But today it's 1.4 million barrels maximum. It's sometimes like 800,000 barrels a day, which really speaks to where the economy is at. So the other thing I want to talk about in terms of the background is that this book is really the product of a decade-long inquiry into the development challenges of resource-rich countries around the world, with Nigeria as a key focus country for me. And I started out asking a number of basic questions that I found that a lot of people who come from oil-rich and resource-rich countries, they tend to ask this kind of question. So I have friends from Mexico, from Nigeria, from Algeria, a number of other countries, and we tend to have these kinds of discussions. And it's really a question that tends to preoccupy the minds of people. Now, what is the reason for the underperformance of an economy like Nigeria, despite the vast oil, natural resources, and human resources wealth of the country? What role do these resources, especially the oil wealth, play in this economic underperformance? And then, is there any role for power, politics, and decision-making in this economic development challenge that the country is experiencing? So these are the three key questions that I sought to address when I started doing this research, right from, I would say, when I was doing my master's degree, and then I went on to do a PhD, and then with the research, published a couple of papers, and then published this book. So now let's go over some of the key arguments and key messages of the book. This presentation is not really meant to be a summary of the book. It's really meant to just highlight key arguments and then key points. There's a lot more in there. I hope people get a chance to read it after this presentation. I think I'm going to go over maybe 5 or 6 key messages in this section. So the first key message, and perhaps this is really an argument as opposed to a message, is that we do need an alternative framework for conceptualizing the challenges of oil-rich countries like Nigeria. Why is this the case? Because the prevailing theories and explanations attribute the failure of oil-rich countries like Nigeria to sustain growth. So as we saw, growth even within the last 10 years, 15 years in Nigeria has been slow and in some cases very volatile. So this failure to sustain growth, to industrialize, is attributed to some inherent characteristic in the country. So the 2 key theories I want to highlight here, which I dispute in the book, and my repudiation of these theories, and indeed my challenging of these theories, is not something that I, in a sense, I kind of came up with. There's a large and growing body of literature on this front. So the first set of theories is the idea of an oil curse or a resource curse, that the mere presence of oil wealth or natural resources would cause certain economic pathologies, economic stagnation, corruption, bad governance, and conflicts. So indeed, it is the case that there are oil-rich countries, whether it's Nigeria, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, etc., that you see some of these pathologies, but there are also countries that have been able to translate the oil wealth into higher incomes, have invested the oil wealth into physical capital, that is infrastructure, and they've been able to raise standards of living, even though they may not have industrialized. And here I'm thinking of the countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council, basically the Arab, wealthy Arab monarchies. You can also think about Norway, you can think about the Netherlands, and beyond oil, you can also think about mineral resources, Canada, Australia. They are high income countries today, but they are also resource-rich countries. Their industrial base is quite limited, but they have high incomes, high standards of living. I mean, we know a lot of Nigerians love to migrate to Canada, right? Canada is a resource-rich country. It still remains that way. Now, the second set of theories is around a neo-patrimonial culture. In the new literature, it's called neo-patrimonialism. So this is basically the idea that a certain kind of culture has taken roots and it is inimical to meaningful policies and then to industrialization, structural transformation, and economic development. What is this culture? And here I'm really, really massively simplifying a huge body of literature, but basically the idea is that a fusion of traditional and modern institutions results in distorted governance institutions that are unable to facilitate the process of economic transformation. So this is me basically boiling down like a huge body of literature into like one sentence. So these are the two key prevailing theories that I would say a lot of analysts, media basically like to attribute to the challenges that oil-rich countries like Nigeria face. Now, the second element of the argument that I'm making, I want to talk about here is that rather than the idea that it's something within Nigeria that is wrong with the oil wells or the culture of the country, that actually the challenge has to do with the nature of a country's political settlement, basically how power interacts with policy making and how this interaction shapes economic outcomes. Now, let me try to break this down. So my key argument is that Nigeria's central economic development challenge is really not the presence of its oil wealth, because we know a country can be used for its oil wealth in different ways. It's also not a cultural issue. It's really a challenge of diversifying and transforming the economy. But this challenge, we need to locate it properly, which is at the intersection of politics and policy making. Specifically here, it is an unstable political settlement or an unstable distribution of political power that forces Nigeria's leaders to be in a perpetual state of crisis management. And again, this is something we can talk about in a little bit more detail. But what I did in the book is I basically looked at the last 20 years of democratic rule in the country. But there are also some historical chapters where I look at Nigeria since independence, whether the democratic governments or the military regimes. And across the board, it's quite consistent. There's just this perpetual state of crisis management in the country. Nigerian leaders have had very little opportunity or very little space to actually sit and focus on the task of structural transformation and industrialization. And this is not an easy thing to do. So in this state of crisis management, the focus tends to be towards easy fix reforms. What are these easy fix reforms? Now, an easy fix reform doesn't mean that it's easy to do, but it's easier than, things like land reform, things like, reforming the oil industry, other elements of policies that can help drive productivity. But let me explain what I mean by easy fix reforms. So Nigerian policymakers are constantly focused on macroeconomic stabilization. That is the case today, actually. The restoration of growth, and then selective public sector reform. So it's maybe at most you might say a decision to streamline a number of public ministries, departments, and agencies. Even that is not an easy thing to do, but that's the most you're going to get. You are not going to get a holistic civil service reform. That has been difficult for every single government in Nigeria to do. They all say they want to do it, they cannot. It's difficult because the focus is on this set of easy fix reforms. Systematic, long-term thinking and orientation within this context remains elusive. So efforts to support what is called in the literature structural transformation that can drive economic diversification and then industrialization, land reform, civil service reforms, actual downstream deregulation of the petroleum industry. These are just a few examples that I'm citing, are extremely difficult, if not impossible to do. And then the final element here is, as I mentioned earlier, there's historical consistency. Now, this is not, me trying to like blame Tinubu or Buhari. No, it's remarkably consistent, from Obasanjo to Eradua to Jonathan to Buhari, and now, let's see where the Tinubu government is headed. And it's regardless of whether this is a military regime or an elected government. The third element of the I think argument I'm laying out today is that I perhaps it's just to zoom in again on what I mean specifically by reforms in Nigeria, particularly in the last I would say 2 decades of democratic rule. They have been focused on crisis management rather than economic diversification or structural transformation. When you look at the time series data on Nigeria's growth, GDP growth, and this is illustrated in the chart on the right-hand side of the slide. The curve in blue represents the GDP growth rate. You find that growth rate has been very volatile, and for the most part has been at around or even under growth rate. But what is interesting is that there was actually a growth episode that occurred in the 2000s. The last time the country had a growth episode was probably after the Civil War. In the entire decade of the 1970s, the economy grew at around 7 to 9% per annum. And then after that, it was basically very volatile. And then there was a lost decade between the 80s up to, I would say, the late 90s to the early 2000s. But from the early 2000s, there was a growth episode. The economy grew at an average of around 7% between 2002 to 2010. And from 2010, at an average of around 5%, up to around 2015, when oil prices crashed. Then the economy, I think there were some quarters of contraction, and then we went into a recession in 2020 as a result of COVID. But what I want to emphasize here is that this growth episode that happened in the first decade of the 2000s followed actual reforms that happened at the time. And this also aligned, and I should have had a chart here, but anyways, this also aligned at the time with a fairly stable balance of power after the transition to democratic rule under the Obasanjo government. A number of reforms were implemented. And then there was a transition in 2007 a little bit contested transition, but it was fairly stable. But then the balance of power, the political settlement became highly unstable from around 2010. I think we all remember what happened around that time when Yar'Adua fell ill, and there was a little bit of a reluctance of his inner circle to hand over power, as should have happened to acting president Goodluck Jonathan, who eventually became substantive president. But that whole process really destabilized the balance of power. And I would argue that that balance of power is still unstable today. So Nigeria's economy rose rapidly during periods of relative political stability. And since the transition to democracy, the only period of relative political stability, and I'm defining political stability here within the context of the notion of distribution of power among elites, rather than like, conflict and that kind of thing. No, I have a specific definition of political stability here. So the balance of power was only stable from around 1999 until 2010. Since 2010, the balance of power in Nigeria has been extremely unstable. In the 1970s as well, immediately after the Civil War, there was a stable balance of power for, I would say, around 10 years or so, until again, the balance of power became very unstable after Gowon was overthrown. Obasanjo, Murtala came in, they transitioned to democratic rule. That was a highly unstable and very corrupt democracy, which was overthrown by military rule, and then it just kind of continued to remain unstable until the transition to democratic rule in 1999. So now I want to zoom in even more narrowly to talk about the actual policy reforms that happened during that growth episode of the 2000s that were able to not only drive growth, but also expand non-oil sources of oil. So two things happened. Aggregate growth accelerated, but the drivers of growth became more diversified beyond oil. So first point, the growth itself was driven by non-oil sectors. I have on the lower left-hand side of the slide, decomposition of growth in the Nigerian economy. Non-oil GDP growth rate represented by the blue line, dark blue line, and then the oil GDP growth rate represented by the teal, the lighter shade of blue. Non-oil sectors actually grew faster than the oil sector between 1999 and 2019, within a 20-year period. And in fact, when you look at the data again, for the most part, the oil sector was contracting. And again, we know this, like we can see other kinds of data and evidence. I started off this presentation by talking about the actual output of the oil industry in Nigeria declining over time. And this is certainly reflected in the GDP data. Whereas non-oil sectors, particularly services, actually expanded. Agriculture too expanded, not necessarily as a result of increases in productivity, but more around a factor accumulation, more people working in agriculture, for example, rather than using more technology. So the other key point I want to talk about here is that what we also saw is that the oil sector share of GDP actually declined. So at the turn of the century, the oil sector share of GDP was somewhere in the region of 40%, nearly half of the country's GDP. And this is represented in the dark brown shaded area, on the right-hand side of the slide. You can see its decline over time, which is quite significant. Whereas the services, in particular as a share of GDP, actually expanded. And we know there were reforms around the banking and financial sector, ICT, the telecom sector liberalization in particular. Those were all pretty significant, and these are things that we remember happening. But what is interesting is Nigeria just did not do much with respect to trade, and it's something I'm going to talk about in the addendum. The fifth point I want to talk about here is that despite what we saw during this growth episode of not only accelerated growth, at least for like a decade and a half, but also an expansion of the non-oil sources of growth, as well as the non-oil share of the GDP. So basically, some diversification of Nigeria's GDP to the extent that today, the country's GDP, and it depends on a lot of factors here, how you calculate the GDP, the value of the naira at any point in time, etc. And the oil sector's share of GDP is not more than 15%. In fact, a few years ago, it was under 10%, which was actually significant. If you remember, we started off this century with the oil sector constituting more than 40% share of GDP. So this diversification of Nigeria's GDP has not translated or is not reflected in Nigeria's exports or fiscal revenues. And some of the data are a little bit dated here because obviously when I finished the research for the book, the data I had available were only until, I would say, the year 2020 maximum. But anyways, this is still, I think, relevant. So the panel on the left-hand side of the slide reflects the distribution of exports. And you can see that the oil sector's share of exports is well over 80%. I think it's somewhere around 85 to 90% today. And oil revenues still account for more than 50% of government revenues. Again, this depends on a number of factors at any point in time. I think one of the reasons why also oil has declined as a share of government revenue is that the federal government has ramped up borrowing, so that has reduced the oil earnings as a share of government revenue. But I think there's also been a little bit increase in tax revenues. Nevertheless, we are still at around 50% of government revenues coming from oil earnings. And as a result of these two phenomena, the Nigerian economy remains highly volatile or highly susceptible to global oil price shifts. Not necessarily because of the GDP itself, but through the mechanism of export earnings and fiscal revenues. The sixth point, I think it was the sixth or the sixth. The sixth point I want to make here is I want to move to the subnational level. And again, the data here are a little bit dated, but they still give you a sense of where things are at. The point here is that this dependence on oil revenues is even more acute at the subnational level because Nigeria is a federation. There are 36 states. Each of these states constitutionally has fiscal and political autonomy to take a lot of decisions, to implement a lot of policies, education, healthcare, municipal infrastructure, etc., on behalf of the citizens. So in fact, if you want to think about poverty reducing policies, a lot of them have to be implemented at the subnational level. But the majority of Nigeria's 36 states depend on federal allocations for the bulk of their revenue, with the exception of, I would say, Lagos State, Ogun, Rivers. I think Kaduna has kind of moved up the rankings a little bit. I've not looked at recent data, but I think Kaduna should probably be number 4, number 5, somewhere there. Kano has probably moved down the rankings from where it was at number 4. But the vast majority of Nigeria states, with the exception of maybe, let's say, 5 states maximum, derive more than 50% of their subnational revenues from oil earnings. So basically, they wait for federal allocations from oil earnings to be sent to them every month. Whereas state-generated revenue or internally generated revenue, as it's colloquially known, constitutes a smaller share of their budgets. So this is represented in the chart on the lower left-hand side of the slide. On the right-hand side of the slide, what I did at the time was to look at the annual budgets of Nigeria's states with the GDPs of some African countries. And I used 2013 figures for a specific reason. This was really the peak of the oil boom for Nigeria in this century. So it's interesting, even now, Nigeria should be experiencing an oil boom because oil prices are at over $80 per barrel, but Nigeria is not experiencing an oil boom. In fact, there's basically the fiscal crunch. I wouldn't call it a fiscal crisis yet. Something we can talk about a little bit later. So I used 2013 figures for that period, for that reason, because this was like peak oil production for Nigeria at the time, probably producing close to 2 million barrels, maybe 1.8 million barrels a day. Oil prices were at over $100 per barrel. So you can see that states like Rivers, Akwa Ibom, Lagos, their annual budgets exceed the GDPs of countries like Cabo Verde, Central African Republic, Seychelles, Comoros, Guinea-Bissau, etc. So I think I added this just to illustrate, not just for Nigerians, but also for those interested in Nigeria, that these states are very, very important political and administrative entities, and so much relies on their ability to generate revenue, to drive their own subnational growth, and to be able to implement meaningful policies. Now, I want to highlight, again, as you can see, we're starting from like a very general and like drilling down to really, really specifics here. So now I want to talk about Lagos very, very briefly, and there's an entire chapter devoted to Lagos. The story of Lagos within this century is a very interesting one, because as we all know, Lagos is a state that has been able to, at the very least, diversify its fiscal revenues. This is a disaggregation of Lagos state revenues over a 19-20-year period. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide, the chart on the upper part, federal allocation has declined as a share of total Lagos state revenue, whereas internally generated revenue from taxes and a number of other sources that has increased. But Lagos is also able to borrow more, float bonds, and do a number of things. So this is Nigeria's commercial capital, and it's been able to diversify its revenues. And this fiscal diversification, and we need to give credit where it's due, is the result of deliberate policy reforms that were implemented within the early to mid 2000s by the current president when he was governor of Lagos, and then some of his successors, Fashola and Bode and others. And I go into detail in terms of the drivers or the change in mindset to be able to implement these policy reforms in Lagos. Ruling elites became reform-oriented because of constraints that they faced, whether it was inter-party factionalization, population explosion, urban decay, violent crime, or intergovernmental schisms. These pressured policymakers to implement tax and public finance reforms. So again, going back to the earlier part of my argument about easy fix reforms, not necessarily because they are easy to do, but they are relatively easier implementation of tax and public finance reforms, where that was very evident in Lagos, and we've seen the results. Whereas in a state like Kano, and there's another chapter devoted entirely to Kano, my argument here is that, so let me go back to the Lagos slide, because there's another point here, which is that the results we have seen with respect to fiscal diversification in Lagos, yes, are a result of reforms, but also speak to the endowment structure of Lagos. And here I'm going back to kind of classical Econ 101. You really have to understand the endowment structure of a particular place. Lagos being more of a service economy, being coastal, not necessarily being a very agricultural state, with like a large presence of enterprises that can actually be taxed, businesses, middle class citizens and residents and consumers who can actually pay taxes, right? Whereas the vast majority of Nigerian states do not have the same endowment structure as Lagos. So Lagos, in a sense, also exemplifies the rise and the growth of the service economy that we've seen in Nigeria over the past 2 decades plus. Whereas a state like Kano, again, given its endowment structure, its geography, and a number of other factors, is also a microcosm of Nigeria's failed industrialization. So again, in the book, and it's not something I really cover here, we look at manufacturing value added as a share of GDP. In Nigeria, it has really not grown that much from its peak in the 1970s. It's still at around, I think the last time I checked, it was at around 12 to 13%. As a share of GDP. So it's not a sector that has grown significantly. It has grown a little bit recently, but not much. And Kano, in a sense, is a microcosm of that. So the agro-allied sectors that really both have been decimated by globalization, but that have just not been the subject of public policies, can be found in Kano by virtue of its endowment structure. And despite its population size and potential, again, we don't really know how many people are in Nigeria, but let's say, for the sake of argument, there are 50 million people in Kano. So despite this population size and then its vast potential, it's a highly entrepreneurial culture that has been that way for centuries, actually. The Kano economy is underperforming. And when I say underperforming, what do I mean? There are many, many indicators, and in the chapter, I look at even agriculture output as basically stagnant or declining across different crop categories. Okay, I'm running out of time. So the economy is underperforming. And then when you look at another metric that I have here in terms of the fiscal revenue, there's just been no diversification of fiscal revenues in Kano, unlike what we've seen in the case of Lagos. And this really is, yes, both a function of the endowment structure, but more importantly, the nature of the political settlement in Kano. Policymakers have not been able to reimagine a growth agenda that harnesses the region's comparative advantage of agro-industrial activities, but also importantly, that supports new industries such as Kano. There's actually an entertainment industry in Kano focused on northern Nigeria and parts of the Sahel, but this is not properly harnessed. I talk about that in a lot more detail in the book. Although some limited efforts have been made at increasing tax revenues, these have been very, very, very limited. And there really has been the absence of a consistent pro-business leadership. Again, I talk about this in a lot of detail in the book. So now coming to the conclusion, and I have perhaps just a few more slides, but I'll go over this very quickly, just tying everything together and going back to the big picture. My conclusion at the time when I published the book, and I think the conclusion still stands, is that Nigeria is neither a failed state, nor is it a developmental state. We're far from that, but it is also not a failed state. it is not doomed to economic stagnation. We know that growth episodes can and do happen as a result of policy reforms that are deliberately implemented. So I would argue that Nigeria is an intermediate state that is capable of episodic reforms that produce growth spurts at best. We could have a growth spurt for about 10 years, but that's the maximum we're going to get. Because in its current configuration, it is incapable of implementing consistently policy reforms that transform and diversify the economy, and this largely is as a result of the unstable political settlement. Therefore, the country and policy elites are constrained to short-term stabilization policies, as we're seeing right now under the Tinubu government. What are the policies that are being implemented are stabilization policies? What are the plans for increasing productivity in agriculture, manufacturing, in reforming Nigeria's entire trade policy architecture? That has really not been communicated. So we're going to continue seeing easy fixes. At the time, the early 2000s, this was the ICT liberalization, banking and financial sector liberalization, and maybe improvements in public financial management. We're seeing all of the new taxes that are being announced every day. So it's very difficult to see policies that will drive structural transformation and increase productivity and diversify the economy. And these include supply side policies in terms of providing transport, electricity, and connectivity infrastructure, agriculture sector reforms, petroleum sector deregulation, or even on the demand side, implementing social protection policies. And a lot of data in the book around how Nigeria lags behind a lot of other African countries, Kenya, Ethiopia, Senegal, Ghana, on social protection policies in the country. And then finally, civil service reform. That is going to be very, very difficult to implement. The conclusion chapter of the book has these 5 key points. I think we can talk about it in the discussion just in the interest of time. And just very quickly, Patrick, I know I'm out of time, but I do want to talk about this addendum because I suspect a number of people on the call today have questions around these points in mind. So the first point is around the low carbon transition, the idea of an energy transition that needs to happen or that is happening, and how that affects the prospects for economic diversification, industrialization, and development in Nigeria. It's a very, very important question right now. My worry is that I'm not quite sure that, the fact that there are still basic policies that are important that are not being implemented, that, these other big issues that are coming up, I wonder if they're even on the horizon of policymakers. So the 2 key points I want to highlight here are, number one, global oil markets are currently being disrupted as we speak. The nature of demand for fossil fuels, oil in particular, but gas as well. I mean, these are very 2 different types of markets. That is changing in the sense that we're already seeing declining demand for crude oil. In fact, crude oil from a number of other African countries. I have another paper I'm writing that is going to come out very soon on this. So the demand for crude oil from Nigeria in particular, but also other African countries, is declining because countries like the US they already became self-sufficient in oil production with the shale revolution in 2012. Europe wants to decarbonize. And then China is getting discounted crude oil from Russia, but also just getting crude oil from the GCC countries. It's just easier to do business with them than to do business with what is seen as a chaotic Nigeria. Again, I can say this because I'm speaking to a Nigerian audience. So that is something to really keep in mind. And in the long term, there's going to be a secular decline of demand for crude oil from Nigeria and from other African countries. And the second point I want to talk about is that there is a growing demand for minerals and metals that are critical to the clean energy transition, to the manufacturing of clean energy technology, so solar hardware, solar panels, wind turbines, and particularly batteries for electric vehicles. We know that there's going to be an increase of 40-fold for lithium, graphite, cobalt, nickel, among others. This is also an area that maybe Nigeria needs to harness what is called solid minerals, colloquially. Second addendum point is, and I didn't really cover trade in the book, but this is the new line of work for me. Just looking at Africa's trade relations broadly, but specifically Nigeria. This is an area that across the board since 1999 has been utterly neglected in the country. Nigeria's trade policy bench is weak. Nigeria, I don't even know what Nigeria's trade policy is, it's the honest truth. People say, oh, Nigeria is now exporting oil to India. But you see, India is now getting more discounted crude from Russia. So there just needs to be more elaborate thinking and strategy around Nigeria's trade relations with the rest of the world. Because the trade environment is becoming extremely turbulent. The World Trade Organization is very, very, has been disempowered. The global powers are engaged in trade wars, US, China, trade competition, and trade as a share of GDP for the first time in history has stagnated and is actually starting to decline. Because a lot of the advanced economies are no longer interested in free trade for a number of reasons. So this is perhaps a final point. What is Nigeria's trade and investment policy in the 2000s? There's the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which Nigeria should have been at the forefront of utilizing to diversify its exports. That is what the country needs. Yeah, we can talk about Nigeria and the African Growth and Opportunity Act and how that has just not been utilized properly. So this is the book. It's available in Roving Heights, the print copy. You can also download it for free. I worked very hard to make it open access just so that students and others can download it for free. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Zainab. And we're going to post a link to where you can get the book for free. But let me start at the very top and maybe seek to go through a couple of questions very quickly because we've got barely 30 minutes. But number one, there seems to be a contradiction for someone who's not really into the numbers that much. If you say that we've seen a spike in non-oil contributions and we say we're not a diversified economy, there seems to be a definitional incongruence for people who are not really expert at this. So can you really unpack for us what diversification means? And in the book, you touched on the 3 different types of diversification. If you can just do that in a minute. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm muted. I had a cold, so I'm still coughing a little bit. So very, very good question. And in the book, I do provide a definition of economic diversification. And interestingly, let me get a little bit technical here. In the economics literature, there is the notion of economic diversification is not necessarily a thing. You either focus on structural transformation, that is when an economy moves from low productivity to higher productivity in terms of labor, in terms of capital, and in terms of the use of technology, right? You move from like subsistence agriculture, small scale subsistence agriculture to like having labor participate in higher productivity activities, starting with manufacturing and then services, and other types of industry. But within the context of resource-rich countries or economies that tend to be dependent on a particular sector, economic diversification is actually a thing, right? But it's almost like an intermediate step towards becoming industrialized and is associated with that process of economic transformation. So that's kind of the technical jargony explanation. Now, in terms of the more day-to-day practical explanation of what you say is it could be seen as an incongruence. It's not an incongruence, but if we take economic diversification as an important objective for an economy in Nigeria, then we need to break it down into its specific components. So how diversified is the GDP, the economic activity, economic output being what GDP measures or captures, how diversified is the country's trade basket, particularly its exports, and then how diversified fiscal or government revenues. So those are the three metrics that I use in the book, that is often used in some of the literature. So with respect to GDP, and as I showed earlier, the economy has become diversified if the objective of diversification is to move beyond dependence on just one sector, or maybe one or two sectors, including subsistence agriculture. We now see services constituting somewhere in the region of 40% or 50% of GDP, etc. So the GDP is it's more diversified. But it's not a GDP that speaks to a country that is industrializing, because if we look at manufacturing value added as a share of GDP, it's again somewhere in the region of maybe 13% maximum. Exports are not diversified at all. Like, we are a classic oil exporting country, dependent entirely on oil exports for foreign exchange. On that front, the oil sector contributes more than 80% of the entire total, and their fiscal revenues too are mostly dependent on oil earnings. Sure. So that would be my explanation.
Fantastic. Now, if we look at the graph you showed, I thought it was a very powerful graph of, the growth between, say, 1999 and 2010, and then, to some extent, 2015. You show that we had a bit of balance of power, a bit of stability in politics. But one can say that that's kind of correlation and not causation. And there was some part of the book, especially the chapter on Lagos, that talked about the reforms that happened in Lagos and how it was a response to a need to survive, and also to all the external pressures that the government at the time was facing. Also, the reforms that the Obasanjo era brought in telecoms, etc., was a response to external factors. So my question is, are we seeing those external factors today that could force the same Lagos crew to move us in the direction of reforms? Or are there other factors, that made that enabled the response we saw from the external forces? So here I'm really trying to unpack what are the elements we need to see, for the reforms to happen.
I think it has two parts. So part one is a correlation versus causation. Very true. I think what I showed you was me explaining basically a correlation between growth happening at a certain point in time and political stability. And it would be good for others to also pick up that line of research. This is just kind of the first step in doing that. But I will say that, and this is the thing with doing mixed methods research. You're trying to combine data with also narratives. But at the end of the day, if we want to do research that speaks to our realities, we do have to combine methods. More using more tools. Mm-hmm. And different methodologies could help us maybe further create stronger associations between different phenomena, is what I would say to that first part of the question. At the same time, we can still use, there's a reason why we do correlations. They're still very important. And it is very, very clear that reforms did happen at a certain period of time. And then when that balance of power shifted, the economy responded, reform stopped, and so that is quite evident as well. To the second part of the question around external pressures motivating certain kinds of policy reforms, absolutely. In fact, that's a key part of the analytical framework that I lay out in chapter 3.
Two or three, yeah.
Yeah, 2 or 3, one of the two, yeah. On where I really talk in detail about political settlements. And again, there's a huge body of literature here around really unpacking. It's basically trying to unpack what does political will mean, right? And people always say, oh, there's no political. What does it mean? We need to unpack that. So that was my own attempt at doing that within the context of Nigeria. When the broader literature, and a lot of it actually talks or speaks to the experience of East Asia, whether Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and then also China. China is a little different, but I'll come to it. And in fact, I think China has more parallels with Nigeria than the others, even though, as I talk about in the book, Nigerian policymakers at a certain period of time loved Singapore. Obasanjo, for example, like he loved Singapore. Fashola, but I don't know if Singapore is a good example for Nigeria, but that's separate. But anyways, the literature on how elites get motivated to pursue reforms and do things differently really talks about the fact that external pressures make them implement difficult reforms. Because as I mentioned earlier, implementing land reform anywhere in the world is difficult. You are going to, there will be winners and there will be losers, and you need to be ready to fight them. At the end of the day, you don't want to fight unnecessarily with powerful people unless you have no option.
Sure.
So they pursue tough policy reforms because of external pressures. And in the case of East Asia, it's actually threats they had from their neighbors. In the case of Taiwan, it's the never-ending civil war with China. In fact, when you speak to Chinese, they'll tell you the civil war between mainland China and Taiwan has not ended. One day they hope to conquer Taiwan. That's kind of the thinking. In the case of Singapore, it's that rivalry with Malaysia, right? And Singapore had to survive. It used to be one union with Malaysia. Singapore became a country, and they basically were not even sure if they were going to survive. So Lee Kuan Yew had to do the unthinkable. South Korea, same thing. The threat from the north. I mean, they also got a lot of FDI investments from the US in particular, but it was really the threat from the north, that the north could really conquer them at any point in time, that motivated them to pursue reforms, to build their economies in order to be able to build their military capabilities. Sure. So it's not that countries that pursue reforms and develop and industrialize do that because, oh, I just want to industrialize. You actually industrialize to build your military capabilities because you face the threat of
response to some kind of an external.
Exactly. So using the framework then within the context of Lagos, my argument is that in the case of Lagos, there was also that pressure that was somewhat external, but within the context of Nigeria, right? Obasanjo at the time withheld funds from Lagos. And then internally, Lagos was on the verge of collapse. All the horror stories on Lagos written in the 1990s. They just had to implement tax reforms to survive. I mean, even if you wanted to be cynical to say people implemented tax reforms so that they could generate revenue to steal, at some point there was no money to steal. Basically, you needed to implement tax reforms to generate something that you could use to run the government, and if you wanted to keep something to the side, I'm not saying they did that, but if you wanted to be cynical, that could also be an explanation. Just to conclude on this point then, do we see the same external pressures now? Ideally, there should be external pressures, and I talk about this in the book, that even at the federal level, that growth episode that we saw in the 2000s during Obasanjo's time came at a point when oil prices were low. I mean, they started to increase at some point, but there was no money in Nigeria at all. Nigeria is basically like a pariah country. You couldn't travel, you couldn't do anything. So like Obasanjo had to go on a reform-oriented trajectory just for his own government's survival and then the country's very survival. There are a lot of pressures right now in Nigeria, but I don't know if they are being quite interpreted that way. Is number one. The understanding of the urgency of the situation is absolutely critical. I don't know if that is the case right now. The second point I'll mention is, and this is where the China example comes in. So you see, in the case of China, it was also propelled to implement certain kinds of reforms, but not necessarily as a result of external pressures, because China is a very big country with a long history, thousands of years, but because of the fear of its implosion. So China historically has gone through these cycles of like ascendancy and then decline. Again, there's a lot of literature on this from Chinese intellectuals, and they would tell you that the fear is of another collapse. They needed to build their economy to prevent another collapse. And I think this is where it could be quite interesting and relevant for Nigeria. The threat that I see for Nigeria is of internal implosion. And I talk about it extensively in the book.
Exactly. And I think there's a Chinese term for it. What the Chinese leaders are most scared of is chaos. You know, they can handle a lot of things, but chaos is what they're scared of. I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to try and rope into one. Where do you see the growth coming from for Nigeria, right? Especially as some scholars like, and you reference this in the book, Hajuan Chang, says that because we missed the third revolution, industrial revolution, there are certain skills we should have picked up that we haven't picked up for the fourth industrial revolution. As we're moving from a productive economy to an industrial economy to a service-led economy, there are certain skills we should have picked up that we haven't picked up. So are we prepared for what you call the smokeless, the non-smokestack economies, or something like that, right?
Stacks, yeah.
Yes.
Industries without stacks.
You speak about that, but where you see that growth coming from, have we picked up the skills we need for that sector?
Okay. So just to begin with, I think there's still some mileage for the industrialization pathway to achieving economic development. It's not over yet. It's just that industrialization today looks slightly different. It's going to be very different from industrialization in the 60s, 70s, 80s, right? But there's still a lot of mileage on that trajectory. What I mean that it's going to be different is it's going to be also a combination. There's a need to drive a service-oriented approach in combination with an industrialization approach. It's not one or the other. It's going to be a little bit of both. So if policymakers just say, oh, we're only going to prioritize the digital economy, I think that is going to be a huge disaster. In Nigeria's endowment structure, they're basically going to have a few poles in the country growing that have the digital skills. Still have a huge industrial, agro-industrial hinterland in the middle belt, in parts of the Southwest, and then of course in the North. And then a mineral belt, basically in the middle belt, the North. So there's still a lot of mileage. So that's one. Number two, then, and in fact, I've already started to talk about this a little bit. Nigeria also has to work with its endowment structure. And the endowment structure is quite varied because it's a big country. It's got a kind of services orientation in parts of the South. Still parts of the Southwest. It's not like the entire Southwest. If you take out Lagos, the rest of the Southwest look like the rest of Nigeria. A kind of oil enclave in parts of the Niger Delta, an agro-industrial base, basically in most of the country, the Middle Belt, the North, I mentioned solid minerals. So all of these have to be thought through. And if we have productivity enhancing policies, and there are a lot of them that can be done, can be implemented, then we can start to see growth unlocked from those sectors. Those sectors are underperforming. Nigeria has a lot of solid minerals, but just not much happening on that front.
Sure.
One thing I think I want to talk about, and this is where I come back to trade, because to me it looks like an easy win. Like, yeah, it's something that can generate results very, very soon. But there's also a small window here. Advanced economies are going to close off market access. Countries have to seize the access that they have to these markets now and in the next 10 years. Otherwise, it's going to change. Yesterday, President Joe Biden announced tariffs on a whole range of Chinese imports to the tune of, $18 billion a year? So 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. I mean, China doesn't really export EVs to the US market or cell phones, but then 50% tariffs on solar panels, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals. This is in addition to tariffs that Trump already placed on $300 billion worth of goods. The EU is going to introduce the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is going to impose tariffs on goods produced around the world in factories that do not use clean energy.
Sure.
Right? So I'm saying all of this to tell you that from where I sit, I see that it's going to be difficult to export. But the tragedy here for Nigeria is a program like the African Growth and Opportunity Act, the country has not used it. And the country has a lot of hundreds of thousands of small and medium scale enterprises that produce a whole range of things. With a little bit of effort from the Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment and all of the parastatals, you can help these countries working through the National Chamber of Industries and Commerce, NACIMA and MAN and all of the others, to get them to improve their standards. It might take a year or two, and they can start to export to the US. That then reduces pressures on the Naira because we start to earn non-oil foreign exchange. It helps add to growth because these firms, the more they export, the more productive they come. It's going to increase. This is something that can be done within the next 2 to 3 years.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And I mean, would love to export to the US, but there's also the AFCTA, that we can use and export to Africa. But I want to come back to the core theory of the book, which is political settlements. And there are 2 questions from our participants that I'm going to take together, right? Just for want of time. The first is from Yakubu Paiko. Is there any nexus between the political will of President Obasanjo, and about, I think it was more around 7% growth rate, although it did about 15% in 2013 or thereabouts, witnessed between 2001 and 2003. What else could be responsible for this high growth rate besides political stability that you spoke about? But let me add a second question to that, and it's from Elima Ezani. And it is, to what extent has the confluence of political interference in Nigeria's political economy and incompetent domestic administration of the Nigerian polity fostered Nigeria's monodependence on oil and an inability to sustain any meaningful diversification efforts? What suggestions do you have towards overcoming these twin issues? And I think it all plays around that, the nature of our political economy and the political settlements theory.
Well, to the first question is a very good one, but I also address it in the book. That spike in growth that you saw, I think in 2002, 2003, actually came from one sector, telecoms. This was when the GSM auctions were done and the sector was liberalized. So like the flow of FDI into the country, etc. that actually came from one sector. I think the sector grew by 155% or something. So that is what explains that particular spike. And again, it's directly the result of the GSM auctions, which is a telecoms sector reform. To the second question about political interference.
Foreign political interference.
Yeah, let me look at it again.
So to what extent has the confluence of political interference in Nigeria's political economy and incompetent domestic administration fostered Nigeria's monodependence on oil?
Okay. Political interference, I think I would like to know what the person means by political interference, but let me guess. You are probably referring to like foreign interference from foreign powers. And of course, it depends here. Are you talking about specific countries or the US, UK, etc., or like, you know, the World Bank, IMF, etc.? And, you know, in a way, I have been in both. So I've worked at the World Bank. Like I've actually not as a like I've done World Bank projects, World Bank missions. I've worked in strategy, and then currently I have a lot of interface with the US government. Here's what I'll say. The notion of interference can happen. I am not gonna sit here and dismiss it, but it's probably not in ways that you think, one. Number two, I think we have enough data to point us to the fact that there are many countries that started on the same trajectory as Nigeria, that are developing countries, that have still been able to make progress with or without political interference. I do think that in the case of Nigeria specifically, what I've seen, based on evidence that I've seen, there's a lot of leeway and autonomy that policymakers have to be able to achieve significant progress. Look, Nigeria is important, but sometimes I think people like to think that the country is more important than it is. I'm sorry, Nigeria is not, it's not South Korea. Like there's no, not yet anyways, a military base there to counter anybody. During the Civil War, a lot of the major powers, maybe with the exception of France, actually supported the coherence of Nigeria. So yes, global powers, major powers will do what they want to do to shape outcomes. But Nigeria is not Egypt, where, the fate of Israel, for example, which is a key ally for the US, lies in what Egypt does. So Nigeria is important, but probably not as important as you like to think, especially now that the US produces its own shale oil. So what I want to say here is that policymakers have a lot of autonomy. And at the end of the day, even an entity like the World Bank, they can offer advice. They will not tell you what to do. And what I've seen working in other countries is actually, because at the end of the day, a loan from the World Bank, in particular, maybe the IMF is slightly different, is actually your money from the future that you're taking today. You have a lot of power to determine how that loan is used, but you have to be prepared. And what I've seen with a lot of policymakers is they're not prepared. You go to meetings unprepared, you don't have an agenda, you don't have a strategy. The person who comes prepared to a meeting is the one who's going to dictate the terms. So yes, there's interference, there could be interference. Powerful entities would want to have their way, but it's not in ways that you think.
Sure. In fact, I think the general consensus in DC today is that Nigeria doesn't even feature in any of the thinking.
There's no ambassador here.
There's no ambassador. The Africa desk is not focused at the State Department, is not focused on Nigeria issues. You can actually trace it to the drop-off in Nigerian oil significance, to America. But let me come back to some questions again on political settlement, which I think you did a brilliant job in the book in tracing some of our history with trying to do constitutional reviews and some of the elite consensus, that were achieved around rotation of power between the North and the South, etc. But this question is really on what's your view on the recent conversations around Nigeria moving from a presidential to a parliamentary system of government? Do you think it will improve economic indicators? And this question is from Victor Aliko. But let me add another question to it, which is from Wisdom Utin. Is a 4 or 8 year term limit for government officials sufficient to implement and oversee impactful long-term policy reforms? If not, what alternative governance structure or term limits would you recommend to achieve this goal?
So let me start with Victor's question. I think the first part has to do with something around taxes, right?
I left that question because I wanted to group it with another one. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Presidential parliamentary system. I don't think a parliamentary system is going to be good. So actually, before I answer that question, I am not a constitutional scholar. There are people who are experts in these things. But I'll just say, based on the fact that I lived in the UK, I lived there during Brexit. I mean, I studied there. And then I've actually lived a little bit in Europe, worked there as well. And then now I live in the US. So I'm saying this just to explain that in many countries in Europe, they have parliamentary systems. In the US is a federation, and in fact, Nigeria's federation was modeled on the US. So I just seeing things happen live, and parliamentary systems are incredibly unstable. It's not a coincidence that Nigeria ended up in a civil war during the First Republic. And I don't know what it is about parliamentary systems that makes them unstable. I mean, you could just have a government, the prime minister loses the vote of confidence, and then you have to call an election. Look at the UK. They are having an election every, I don't even know now, I've lost track, every 2 years. And then the current prime minister is not elected. No, it's just not, no. But I also understand where questions around reverting to a parliamentary system are coming from, because there's a perception that the current presidential system has not worked, it's too wasteful. I still think the presidential system is better, and here's why. And maybe this gets to a very contentious debate that keeps happening in Nigeria around federalism. Again, not a federalism expert, there are experts on that. But what I'll say is, at a certain level of development, especially where you're low income with large numbers of poverty, with a huge country, there needs to be an element of centralization. I know this is something that Nigerians are very emotional about. They want to see more devolution of power. I get where it's coming from, because military rulers abused a lot of the power that they had. But a federation needs some element of centralization. Why? Because you need some kind of coordination. That coordination role has not been played very well. Again, it's been abused in Nigeria, but you need some level of centralization and coordination while still having units that are somewhat autonomous. And the Nigerian constitution, when you read it, gives states a lot of autonomy that they don't even max out on. You can generate your revenues, you can implement so many policies. They don't do that. They don't. So for me, I think this is still the best system that could work for Nigeria. I think we just need to make sure that people are delivering and they are accountable, but there still needs to be some kind of glue that holds the country together. So in the book, I also talk about the need to really re-examine the distribution of oil revenues for equity. Again, it's something that I know is very emotional, particularly people from the Niger Delta, like, you know, oil is coming from our region and the region is devastated. Absolutely correct. Needs to be a better debate about that. I think ultimately we need to move towards 100% resource control ultimately, but this needs to be phased. let us phase it so that state governments know that this is not going to subsist forever. In fact, the reality is, the oil oriented model of development has to change anyways. Demand is going to collapse globally at some point in the future.
Sure.
So that's what I would say.
There are a few questions here from Jesse Dinju, but I think you've addressed it in one word. What do you think the fundamental cause of Nigeria's economic woes, and how can we solve this problem? A similar question again from Yakubu Paiko. What are the factors responsible for the low production, particularly now that there's relative peace in the Niger Delta? Does OPEC quota allocation in any way contribute to this? I think you've kind of touched on those, but I want to come back to Victor Aliko's question on statistics. Statistics shows that countries that depend on taxes do better than those that depend on natural resource endowments like oil. Do you support Nigeria's recent fiscal diversification moves through taxes for an economy that has averaged less than 2% growth in the last decade? Essentially, if the economy is not growing, if the people are poor, should they be taxed at the level that we're seeing it today? Or what else could the government be doing, given that it's really facing a fiscal cliff?
Okay, so I do want to talk very briefly about oil production. And again, I have some work that will be published soon on that. I do think it's very important. Yes, oil production is low despite relative peace in the Niger Delta because there has not been investments over the past, I would say, 2 decades or so. Part of the reason is, of course, the insurgencies in the Niger Delta. I mean, the reality is also there have been so many new discoveries, not only on the African continent, but also around the world. Guyana is now a major oil producer, and I've done some work in Guyana. I mean, today it's the fastest growing economy in the world, 22% projected growth rate for this year. So like, there are alternatives to a lot of oil companies, and in fact, a lot of them have divested from Nigeria, particularly their onshore assets, and they might soon start divesting some of their offshore assets. So it's just a lack of investment for the most part, whereas the GCC countries, their oil production has actually ramped up. And this is really the data that I want to show in the new work that I have coming out. It's very important because I don't think it has quite sunk in the mindset of a lot of policymakers in Nigeria, that not only production has been stagnant and declining, that they know, but within the broader context of changing global oil markets and other alternative sources of supply, it does not look good at all. On taxes, so it's not really the OPEC production quota that has very little to do with the situation. On raising taxes, tax to GDP ratio in Nigeria is very, very low. It's actually one of the lowest in Africa. So there's definitely a case to be made for increasing taxes as a share of GDP. At the same time, if there are other less painful ways to generate revenue, it is also worth pursuing that. Like, Nigeria does not have to be Switzerland or Belgium or France, where, you look at your income taxes, you pay 50% of your paycheck goes to taxes. That is painful. But the citizens also have a lot of voice on how their taxes are used. So, and there's a lot of infrastructure, infrastructure, good healthcare, etc. You can see what your taxes are being used for. And there's also a whole literature on taxes that, especially for low and middle income countries, it makes sense to focus on progressive taxes that do not hurt the poor. And that is not VAT. VAT is a very regressive tax that taxes consumption. So there are a variety of other taxes we can look at that are progressive, that will not hurt poor people. Property taxes, for example, there's this whole urban legend about the empty mansions in Abuja and major cities. Why not impose heavy taxes on those? Taxes on certain kinds of consumption that target the upper deciles of the income distribution rather than poor people. so it makes sense to increase taxes, but we also need to think carefully about the kinds of taxes that are being introduced and making sure that they are progressive. And then finally, if there are other ways to generate revenue less painfully, there's no reason to try to be like Scandinavia. I mean, look at the GCC countries, they have very low taxes and they still have good standards of living. And their policymakers tend to be quite responsive. Maybe they're not accountable, but they are responsive to the needs of the citizens. So.
And we are really out of time, but let me see if I can squeeze in this last question from Najim Animashan. And his question is again around, the governance system. Many of the Nigerian states, subnationals, are they fiscally viable? I think you've already answered that question, that they're not. Now, while the presidential system may work, do you have an administrative framework that lends itself to development for the states? And I think you spoke a little bit about this in the book.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is, again, given the way Nigeria is a very big, very diverse country, and honestly, when you live in the US, you see so many parallels here. Every state in Nigeria has its own character and personality, and it's the same thing here. And I can see why people would want to retain that kind of cultural autonomy, and it makes sense. So let's find a way to make it work. Like, we're human beings, we're capable of finding solutions. There's always a solution if you sit and think hard enough. There are ways the states can generate revenue. A couple of states have tried to do like land titling, streamline taxes, but add more fees to certain kinds of things. There are ways to generate revenue. Sure. I mean, I don't even have to sit and list. There are ideas that have been put forward and they exist. I think governors also need to take more responsibility on this front.
Fantastic. So you're now stuck in an elevator with President Tinubu and you're going up a flight of stairs, a number of stories, and he says to you, what are the core elements? What are the core design elements for a set of policies, programs that can help me really diversify the economy? What are the components that should be in that design?
Well, my elevator pitch is going to be, well, let's have a separate conversation on the design because that's going to take a long time. But here are three things you should prioritize. Trade policy. Throw everything you have at electricity. Everything, just ignore everything else and just do electricity. That's it. And just be like, I'm going to be the president who delivers on electricity. Because I show in the book how electricity is the key bottleneck for small and medium scale enterprises. So the SMEs get electricity and then they're able to export not to the rest of Africa, but also around the world. Mm-hmm. And then security. Because I know President Tinubu is I've seen him speak at different fora, talk about FDI, but who's going to come when people are being kidnapped? So those would be the three things. Design elements, we can talk about that, in another meeting, if we want to talk about that a bit more. But those are the three things.
Fantastic. And maybe last question for you. What are you working on now? The book is done. What are you focusing on at the Africa program? And is there another book in the offing?
Yes. So let me start with the last question. Actually, there are like two books in the offing. One is on the energy transition and climate change and what it means for developing countries. This builds on a TED talk that I gave last year. So I was asked to submit a book manuscript, so I have to find time to write it. A second book idea is actually on US economic diplomacy with Africa. I think a lot of African countries just don't understand the US and So, but more focused on economic diplomacy. So those are the books, very little to do with Nigeria. But then the third thing I want to mention in terms of just like actual detailed original and in fact empirical research that I'm doing is one on trade policy and the shifting demand for the kinds of products that African countries want to export, oil and gas, but also minerals, and what that means for policy making and policy thinking. And then at some point doing something a little bit more focused specifically on Nigeria, the history of Nigeria's trade relations and the challenges the country has experienced in really coming up with a coherent trade policy.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And we're looking forward to it. Just to say, well, first of all, thank you so much for joining us and for that fantastic presentation and for the subsequent discussion. And for everyone else who's joined us, thank you so much. We'll meet again on May 27th when I would have my guest to be Thelma Ekiyo Solanke, the chairperson of the Nigeria Philanthropy Office and co-founder and chairperson of SME.ng. And the theme is impact investing for sustainable development. But hey, Zainab, thank you so much for your time. And it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Very, very nice to be here. Thank you so much for creating this important platform. And thanks to everyone for all of the fantastic questions.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.